Okay, so today we are starting our chapter 2 in social studies. Now, because we're starting a new chapter, we have some vocab words that we will need to put on in our notebooks. So I have the vocab up on the board here, and we're just going to go through some of these vocab words. So you need to write down petroglyph. Should I make it a little bit bigger, or is that big enough? I'll make it a little bigger. So we have petroglyph, Petroglyph. Then skip a couple lines. Well, actually, you know what? We'll go through it one at a time. So a petroglyph is a rock carving made by people. Which makes sense because I would hope animals aren't making a rock carving. So a petroglyph is a rock carving made by people. An elder is an older member of a community who is respected for their wisdom. Think about the elders in your life, maybe grandparents, maybe you have an older neighbor. So there's elder people who you know are respected for their wisdom. The archaeologist is a scientist who studies past human life and activities by examining physical evidence such as tools, fire pits, and ruins from dwellings. So they study past human life and activities by examining physical evidence. So those things that you can touch, physical evidence. Perspective is the way a person sees and understands the world. We've been talking in here about multiple perspectives and how every story, there's different perspectives to it. So it's the way a person sees it. So different people are going to see the same thing in a different way. So there'll be different perspectives on the same event, different ways of seeing it. So it's always good to try to figure out all the different perspectives about something so you can get the full picture. When I move up, if you hadn't finished it, you can always go back to see the video tonight and fill in any of the missing vocab, or you can look in the back of your book in the glossary to fill in any missing vocab. So I'm going to erase this so we can move up. Oral history. Oral history is the purposeful retelling of stories about the past events and legends of a group in order to teach about that group's culture. Whew, that's a long one. So the oral history is retelling stories. Oh my goodness. What is going on? So it's retelling the stories about past events and legends in order to teach about a group's culture. So think about the last couple of weeks, we've talked about some of the oral history of Minnesota. We talked about Paul Bunyan. That would be a legend that helps tell about our culture here in Minnesota. We talked about how lumberjack is a big business in Minnesota because of all of the trees. So Paul Bunyan's an example of oral history of Minnesota. An artifact is any object made, used, or altered by humans. Any object made, used, or altered by humans. So think about some of the stuff that we brought in when we brought in our objects last week. Those were artifacts. Some of us had ancient artifacts when we brought in the arrowheads. So those are all artifacts that are made, used, or altered by humans. Then we have the scientific method, a process using experiments and careful observation to test ideas and theories. It's not just used in science class. We will see how science and social studies relate to each other. So scientific method is a process using experiments and careful observations to test ideas and theories. And our last one is hypothesis. Again, Again, a science word. It's a science vocab word that we also use with social studies. And a hypothesis is an assumption, an educated guess, or theory. So these are all key words that are going to be in our chapter. These are words that we will most likely see again when we get to our tests. So you want to understand all of these words. We will see them in our reading, and they're important enough for us to go over them, so they're important for us to know throughout this whole chapter. So again, if you don't get through writing everything down right now, go back and look in the glossary at the back of your book. Go back and watch the video tonight. Freeze the video as you're writing down the different definitions. So let's go ahead and open our textbooks to chapter 2. So chapter 2 is evidence from the past. We talked about evidence on Friday when we brought in our artifacts from home, our different objects, and we talked about what evidence we could get from it. What does that tell us? We drew those conclusions. So we're going to look at the different evidence that we have from the past. So let's look at page 11. Life in Minnesota today is very different than it was for people living here thousands of years ago. Explore how storytelling and physical evidence help people understand how others lived in the past. So that storytelling is which of our vocab words? Which of the vocab words that we just did would be storytelling? Paul? The oral history. And the physical evidence would be which of our vocab words? What was that, Bria? Colin? The artifacts. Those are the physical evidence. All right, so during this chapter, we're going to look for how do archaeologists study the past? What role do elders play in preserving knowledge about the past? How has Minnesota's landscape changed over the last 12,000 years? How did early people adapt to life over time as the landscape changed? And what are the steps in the scientific method? Because that scientific method isn't just used in science class. So let's turn to page 12. Who would like to start reading? About halfway between. Jace, can you start reading for us?
About halfway between. Today's towns of Jeffers and Humphrey is a place about where history is written in stone. A 23-mile-long ridge of red rock rises above the surrounding prairie and farmland. Changes in the shape of land over hundreds of millions of years created this ridge. Long ago, deposits of sand and mud collected in the area. Slowly, deposits compressed into soft rock, and then into hard stone, quartzite. Much of that stone remains hidden under layers of soil and water. In some places called outcroppings, the stone is visible. There on the outcroppings the red rock region begins to explore Minnesota.
So we're looking at not just the storytelling and the physical evidence, we're looking at the actual landscape and how that's changed over time. So at several places on this ridge, it looks as if a giant has scratched the rock with its fingernails. The rock has, in fact, been scratched, but not by a giant. The scratches were caused by heavy ice sheets called glaciers as they inched across the ground. Glaciers have covered what is now Minnesota many times. The last one melted away from the southwestern Minnesota about 12,500 years ago, or about 10,500 BCE. Now, a lot of times when we see dating, sometimes we see BC, and sometimes we'll see BCE. This textbook will use BCE. It's the same as BC. And then instead of using AD, we'll use CE. So BCE is the before Christ time. We know that AD, Anno Domini, was the after his death. That's going to be called CE. So BCE is the earliest because it's before. And then CE will be coming after. Peyton.
Why is it changed like that?
There's just two ways of doing it, and they're just aligning this with the history standards that we have, and that's just the form that the history standards use. So that's what this book is going to use. Just like how there's Celsius and Fahrenheit, there's different ways of measuring things. So this is the type of measuring that we're going to use in the book. So all these glaciers that covered Minnesota, what did they leave behind? We talked about this last week. Ryan? Sam, sorry.
These are the ones that are now lakes.
Yeah, they left those big craters that are now lakes. So the glaciers, as they were scratching away at the rock, they were also leaving areas for all those lakes. Because we are the land of 10,000 lakes, there had to have been a lot of glaciers leaving those lakes behind. The ridge also shows other marks that were carved not by glaciers, but instead by people. Humans have begun living in this region about 12,000 years ago. This was approximately 10,000 BCE. They lived in small groups, adapting to the changing environment and developing new ways to live together with the people and the world around them. Around 7,000 years ago, people began leaving their mark on a long stone ridge in southwestern Minnesota. This happened around 5,000 BC. So we're going to be seeing what these people have left behind and what, as historians, we can learn about their culture. If we look at those maps on page 13, it says between 1600 BCE and today, the landscape of this region changed drastically. The place we now know as Minnesota was covered once in ice. As the glaciers melted, they left behind deep pits where the ice had dragged boulders. Gradually, the pits filled with ice water, creating thousands of lakes. So you can see with that yellow, the white is the glacier, and as it's receding and leaving behind, it's leaving that yellow. And then you can see how Minnesota was left as the glacier finally receded all the way back. Do we have any? Yes. Sam.
What happened to that huge lake in the picture? This in the top left.
That is a good question. That Lake Agassiz, I'm guessing lakes sometimes can recede also, so there wasn't enough water to keep it filled, and so it's probably a much smaller lake now. And it looks like if you look in that last map in the upper left corner, you can see just a little bit of a lake up there, and I'm guessing the lake just kind of receded back. And so now there's just more land surrounding it. So some lakes get smaller, some get bigger. And you'll see from the left picture, the left bottom corner, where that glacier is, you can see Lake Michigan and Lake Huron and Lake Erie. They were smaller. And then look at the right bottom corner, the lakes are bigger. So sometimes the lakes get bigger and sometimes they'll get smaller. All right, I'm going to stop recording.